I'll introduce the speakers as I call them on, and I thought maybe we will start with Andy Lippmann this time, because the other speaker from RAND has just been speaking on the same subject somewhere else, which is the reason for the delay. So Andy Lippmann, interestingly, has a bachelor's degree in forestry.
I do.
So for an anti-terrorist specialist, I think that's...
From the University of California up north. One of the...
He has served as Principal Deputy Director in the National Counterterrorism Center. He's a Senior Policy Analyst at RAND, but he was 30 years in the CIA, and much of that career was involved with dealing with matters in the Middle East, and in particular terrorist matters. So I can't think of anyone with a better qualification to start to lead this discussion. Andy?
Thanks. And it's good to be at a different University of California campus. I actually just flew in this morning from Washington. I was there for meetings, and I spent most of yesterday actually talking about ISIL, or ISIS, or Daesh. I will probably refer to it as the Islamic State, which is, I think, sort of discouraged because it builds them up into something that they want to be but really aren't, which is a state. And actually, I'm going to steal from one of the presentations that we just heard to give you a somewhat of a framework of how to think of the Islamic State, and then how to think about how we're doing. And I think we can then talk a little bit about the importance of the relationship between the United States and specifically Australia, but the United States and all of its partners. Because counterterrorism, counterinsurgency, the effort against the Islamic State really is a global problem that has to be tackled globally. So intelligence officers by nature are, Brian and I were just talking about this, among the most pessimistic people on the planet. It's a pretty depressing business because they pay us to analyze problems. If something is going really well, they don't need me. So, I've been involved in virtually all of the horrible foreign policy disasters of the United States for the last 30 years. I have a lot of experience in looking at the dark side of things. But I want to start with something that's less pessimistic. And the first aspect of the Islamic State is what it does in Iraq and Syria. It's caliphate. And I spoke to a group about a year and a half ago, sort of when it was at its peak. It had just taken all this territory. And I said at the time, I thought the Islamic State, the caliphate, would in about 5 years sort of wear itself out. That it would implode on itself for a lot of different reasons. One is it had too many enemies. 2 is it had limited resources. 3 is it really mistreated its constituency. And I actually think 5 years may be too short, but I stand by that. I think the Islamic State, the caliphate, that entity in Syria and Iraq is bound to fail. So that's sort of the good news. And I think the Kurds are making progress. The Shia militias in Iraq are gradually making progress. With Russian help, the Syrian government is chipping away at what the Islamic State originally obtained last summer. So, I think the trajectory there is pretty good. But then you go outward, outside of Syria and Iraq, and you have all of the various provinces. And they have provinces now, 11 of them, in Afghanistan, in Chechnya, in Libya, and Nigeria. And you really can't look at them. Some of them are real. And I think the one I worry the most about right now is Libya. The Islamic State has a real foothold in Libya. Libya could eventually, if the Syrian and Iraq caliphate sort of collapsed, they could move into Libya, and it would be a tremendous problem. So, but that problem varies, and again, the international nature of it makes international cooperation essential. The third aspect is maybe the most worrisome from a long-term perspective, and that is sort of the international ISIS cloud. You know, their social media advocates, their tweeters and retweeters, the people who are, like in San Bernardino, motivated by the ISIS ideology to commit violence. That is a presence that we're going to struggle with. We, being the Western world, our partners, the intelligence services, law enforcement, for a generation or more. If you think about it, we've been fighting Al-Qaeda full force. We've spent $1 trillion. We've made travel almost impossible. We've put barriers in front of all our buildings. And that's been going on for 15 years, and we're still at it. And Al-Qaeda was a relatively small, well-organized, well-run, but a very different organization than the Islamic State. So I think we have a ton of challenges in store for us. I am relatively optimistic that the caliphate will go away. I am a lot less optimistic that we're going to be able to deal with this sort of murky, motivated, inspired presence around the world.
So our second speaker will be Brian Jenkins, who's a senior advisor to the president of RAND Corporation. Written books on this subject, including Will Terrorists Go Nuclear? Terrifying thought. But apart from that, he was a Special Forces soldier for many years, decorated Special Forces soldier. So he's had to do the hard stuff on the ground. But again, multi-skilled, because President Clinton brought him into the White House to work on a commission on aviation safety, and he's also assisted the government in the US on transportation issues, obviously multi-skilled, and from what I heard earlier, highly respected and greatly appreciated by the RAND Corporation. So Brian, do you want to give us your take?
Thank you very much. Actually, in terms of cooperation between the United States and Australia, in special forces in Vietnam, Australian special forces and US special forces were completely integrated. That is, it's not that they served side by side. A single special forces A-team would have both Australian and American members of the team completely interchangeably. So the relationship goes back a long way. In terms of education, I have to admit to being an even bigger fraud than my friend Andy. My degree, my undergraduate degree is in fine arts as a painter. I have a postgraduate degree in history and another in humanities. So if we have terrorism in ancient Greece, I'm prepared. But fortunately, my undergraduate and one graduate degree are from here at UCLA. It was a long time ago. There was still free parking on campus when I was here. That lets you know how long ago that was. Look, Andy is correct. We face a very complex, multi-layered threat, and I agree with Andy's assessment that regardless of whether or not the Islamic State survives as a territorial entity, or whether Mr. Assad departs Damascus sooner rather than later, we, in fact, are going to be dealing with the effluence of these conflicts in Syria and Iraq for the foreseeable future. That's just the reality. What began as political protest has increasingly become a sectarian contest. It is existential from the perspective of the participants. I think the fighting in some fashion is going to continue. So long as that fighting goes on, the rest of the world is going to be dealing with the effluence of that. That includes dealing with a volume of refugees that has begun to rival the numbers of World War II. We're talking about 12 million Syrian refugees in a country of 21 million. 4.5 million of those are outside of Syria, about 7.5 million displaced within Syria. We're talking about 4 million Iraqi refugees, about 3.25 million displaced within the country, another 500,000 or so outside of the country. And as we see the tremendous pressure that those plus others from Libya, elsewhere in North Africa, are putting on, that pressure's on Europe. So that's one dimension of it. A second dimension is that so long as this entity exists, this Islamic State exists, it is going to be both a launching pad for terrorist operations, and it is going to be a magnet for foreign volunteers coming to join these groups, especially the Al-Qaeda group, or even more so, the Islamic State in Syria and Iraq. Now, numbers here are soft and squishy, but we're looking at probably 30,000 foreign fighters have joined the fighting in Syria and Iraq. Most of them from neighboring Arab countries, but about 5,000 or so from Western countries, from Europe, United States, contingent from Australia. And that is a concern, because these individuals have absolutely no future outside of the Islamic State. And so if Andy is correct, and in the coming years we begin to see the collapse or implosion of the Islamic State, that in turn perversely could lead to an increase in terrorist activity elsewhere around the world as these individuals look for new fronts or come back home. Some of them are going to come back home disillusioned, traumatized, but some of them are going to come back home determined to carry on their violent campaigns. And that is a source of great concern. The other part of it is the inspirational effect of this ideology. Now, we've been talking about ISIL or ISIS or Islamic State here, but the inspirational effect abroad to the fighters, whether we're talking about those who carried out the attacks in Paris or those who carry out the attacks in San Bernardino or elsewhere, I'm not sure they all make these exquisite distinctions between Al-Qaeda and ISIS. I mean, look, Mr. Farouk, who was responsible for the attack at the Inland Regional Center in San Bernardino, he began his plotting, his thinking about this before the emergence of the Islamic State. His wife, on the morning of the attack, pledges her allegiance to the Islamic State. In the Paris attacks last January, the Kouachi brothers, who attacked the Charlie Hebdo, the newspaper offices, pledged their attack to Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula. Their comrade, Koulibaly, said he was carrying out his attack on behalf of the Islamic State. So these are racing stripes that they put on for their operations, not so much a commitment to this organization or that organization. That's pretty fluid. In fact, looking ahead, whether it's the result of a decline of Jabhat al-Nusra, which is Al-Qaeda's affiliate in Syria, or, as Andy points out, the decline of the Islamic State, it's not inconceivable to see those fighters go over to the remaining one, or even to see a merger of these two again. So I don't think we should make these sharp distinctions. There are some interesting differences, though, and it has an importance in terms of terrorism, and that is that the Islamic State, it exhorts homegrown terrorists, as did Al-Qaeda. It has been much more effective in its use of social media, which means, and this is statistically demonstrable, that it is attracting a younger audience. So the median age of homegrown terrorists and of those going abroad has dropped from the high 20s, 27, 28, down into the low 20s, 23, 20, 24, and a lot of late teens in there that are pulling that down. The second, and that says something, by the way, about judgment, brain development, all kinds of things. The second thing is that as part of ISIL's publicity campaign, it advertises unlimited violence. I mean, it does not make a secret of its beheadings, mass shootings, crucifixions, things of this sort. In fact, this is its claim to authenticity. We behead, therefore we are the real, true believers in this. Now, what does that mean on the reception end of this? It means that is attracting some people who at the very least are not put off by that, and in many cases are attracted by that. And so we're beginning to see a qualitative difference in these more recent cohorts of people going over to the Islamic State or those who are carrying out attacks here. At the same time, we see, and it's either because of recruiting or because how long this has been going on, or perhaps because of the media coverage this gets, we are seeing increasingly the ideology being used basically as a conveyor of individual discontents. In other words, it's not the incorporation of these fervent beliefs that is driving people to this aggressive activity. It is rather that we are finding people who are troubled individuals, in some cases with histories of mental disorder, in some cases substance abuse problems, who are finding resonance, reinforcement, direction, and legitimatization in the ideology. And that makes this a much more difficult phenomenon to deal with, because now it's not a matter. By the way, ISIS is interesting, comparing it to terrorist groups that we dealt with in the past, in the 70s and 80s. They have no demands. It's not, we will bomb or shoot unless you get out of Northern Ireland or give the Basque provinces their independence or enact these economic reforms or do this. There are no demands. This is process-oriented, not progress-oriented. This fight, bin Laden said it himself, but ISIL views it. This fight began centuries ago and will go on to Judgment Day as part of ISIS's appeal in its doctrine, is that this is the final showdown between the believers and the unbelievers. A lot of end-time thinking. So the end-time thinking, the younger cohort, the concept of unlimited violence, the conveyor of individual discontents, this is turning, as I say, what is a counter-terrorist issue into a broader societal problem. And boy, that is tough for us to deal with. I said this years ago, and I keep on repeating it, that because of technological developments in the world, because of communications, because of development in weapons, that small groups with a limited capacity for violence, I mean limited, compared to, look, yes, we have pictures of ISIS in tanks. They are not the Wehrmacht. This isn't World War II. But because of these changes, power, and here I mean power defined crudely, the capacity to kill, destroy, disrupt, create fear and alarm, oblige us to divert vast resources to security against those attacks. That is coming down into the hands of smaller and smaller groups, whose grievances, real or imaginary, it's not always going to be possible to satisfy. And how the hell we deal with that within the construct of a democracy, Australia or the United States or the others, and remain a democracy, is one of the major challenges we face in this century.
Ideology much the same. Consistent with Andy, I think in the end we'll retake the state, but that's only part of the challenge that we face. But Brian reminded us of Australian Special Forces working together, and if we're talking about Australian-US cooperation, Australia is the second largest contributor of military personnel to the coalition in Iraq today. The largest is the US, a little out in front of Australia, but Australia nevertheless is the second largest, so a practical manifestation of how and where we work together in efforts to defeat this challenge. Now, Jeff Bleich, of course you all know, the Honourable Jeff Bleich is a former US ambassador to Australia. Some of you may know that he was a highly distinguished lawyer, practiced in San Francisco and chairman of the Californian State Bar, that he worked as special counsel to President Obama in the White House, and has, like so many Americans, served the public in many ways on many different boards, and he's now, I think I can say, a distinguished businessman as well. But I think of him as a great friend of Australia, a great friend of the relationship, an advocate of the relationship between Australia and the US, and how if we work together we can achieve more than if we work separately. So Jeff, there's the challenge. How from a public policy point of view, diplomatically, whatever, can we do to make it even better effort?
Well, first I have to thank Andy and Brian for their presentation. It reminded me a lot of being back in the embassy. You start each morning in this windowless room with some bad white noise music playing over to make sure no one could pick up what you're discussing, and someone would hand me a little folder of fear and describe just how awful things could be in the world. And you've done an excellent job of accomplishing that. So the question is, once you get that, what do we do? What do we do together? And I think Andy framed it very well in terms of, there are different aspects of, if you want to call it the Islamic State. I like to call it a dash because it's like in chess. The best move in chess is the one your opponent doesn't want you to make. So they hate being called dash, so we'll call them dash, But whatever it is, there are three different levels. One is the level at which they're just trying to grab land, they're trying to establish a true Islamic State in areas that are subject to conflict. And as Robert said, we are the largest and second largest contributor of troops in Iraq to address specifically that threat. One thing to put in context is that threat is not enormous. They have not been able to hold land. They are not well organized and capable of grabbing land for any sustained period of time, and it's reflected in the numbers. Australia is the second largest troop contributor, but it's 728 troops, which is not a major force for the US and Australia. That is a containable challenge, and I think Andy and Brian are appropriately confident about our ability to prevent the Islamic State from actually becoming a state with actual land and borders and the capacity to operate. We can manage them militarily. That leads you to the second group, the Waliya, which is this sort of offshoots across 11 or 12 different nations. Again, looking for distressed nations where there is ungoverned space and the capacity to create mischief which they can launch from there. That is challenging in a couple of ways. One is it makes these areas more turbulent. They're already turbulent areas, and now you add a whole other dimension. It makes it much more difficult for people inside who are trying to restore order and stabilize them to be effective, and it also makes it more difficult for us to operate effectively. So we have a whole series of challenges, and each, it's like, what's that line from Anna Karenina? All happy families are alike, and all unhappy families are unhappy in their own special way. Well, all distressed nations are unhappy in their own special way, and so it just makes the management of that more complicated. The second thing we have to worry about is they're linking arms with other terrorist organizations there. We trotted out a bunch of names. We haven't mentioned, we mentioned Al-Qaeda, but, Lashkar-e-Taiba, Jamaat al-Maya, Al-Shabaab, Hezbollah, lots of organizations out there that would like to do bad things using terrorism as a tool. And in each case, there is a concern about them eventually joining forces and becoming much more effective. So keeping them balkanized, keeping them in these separate regions, keeping them simply as offshoots, and continuing to degrade their command and control is critical. And in that case, what we're really doing is we're not fighting a state, we're fighting like the mob. It's like the mafia, And so when I hear people say we're gonna make the sand glow, we're gonna carpet bomb them. That, it would be saying we're gonna carpet bomb New York to get rid of the mafia. You just wouldn't do it. It would be a crime against humanity, and it wouldn't even be all that effective. They'd know you were going for New York, so they'd go somewhere else. So in fact, they'd be the only people who probably knew how to protect themselves. So what we're doing is what you'd expect. Cutting off their supply of funding, trying to take out their command and control, disrupt their communications, and try and counter their ability to recruit. And then that's the strategy that we have, and we're coordinating very closely with Australia on all of that. Probably our most capable partner in each one of those four elements. And then you get to the third piece, which is, as I think Brian really captured, this dangerous element of foreign fighters, including from Australia and from the United States and from Canada and places where you get kind of a pass when you show your passport, going to Syria, becoming trained, becoming radicalized, developing true fighting skills, and then potentially coming home and forming their own units. What we're really finding, and I'd love Andy and Brian's and Robert's views on this, but what we're really finding is that that's not as big a threat as people would imagine. Just to put it in perspective, in the United States, we lose 14,000, 15,000 people a year from violent crime. We have had, in the past 10 years since September 11, less than 100 people who were killed based on terrorist acts. It doesn't mean that those aren't, terrible tragedies every single time they happen, but it just gives you some sense of scale. It's not fighters coming back. We've got pretty good analytics on who they are and what they've done, and it's hard for them to get back in the country at all through no-fly lists and everything else. It's not even their close affinity group that is a problem. Because, again, with the quality of data analytics now, you can tell a lot about people legally, and who their friends are and who may be logging in with unusual interest. The biggest problem is a kid who lives down the street, who's never gotten into any trouble, kind of an outsider, who admires, idolizes from afar the foreign fighter, and is taking things in, does their own research, and is eventually spotted by people back in the home state and recruited. That, I think, is our biggest challenge, and that's probably our biggest worry. And the most significant aspect of that challenge is not that we can't do it, but we can't do it without one of two major trade-offs. One is having to use data analytics to a level where we really feel we're compromising our privacy. and our civil liberties, and having to have an honest debate about that within a country. I think the other big challenge is that there's an old saying that Ted Turner said, it takes as much effort to figure out a $50 problem as a $50 billion problem. So that's why he wanted to work on a $50 billion problem. But it's true, it takes just as much effort. And so the amount of resources and intelligence and capacity that has to be built in order to get lots of little cells of individuals will be a major distraction of our law enforcement resources, of our anti-terrorism resources, of our national security resources, of our overall national budgets for groups that are responsible for the death of, relatively modest numbers compared to criminals who are continuing to kill, tens of thousands of people a year. Those are big trade-offs. Again, Australia and the U.S. lead in this area, but the policy question is going to be one that will eventually go back to the public about how far are we willing to go in order to create a sense of true security against a threat which will continue to go on and can't be bombed out of existence, can't be killed out of existence, will be part of our landscape for decades to come.
Yeah, just thinking as you've been speaking,
I make people's minds wander.
No, their greatest successes have been in destabilized environments, haven't they? If you look at Iraq after Saddam Hussein, there was a vacuum and governance has proven to be very difficult. Syria, where we had basically a violent dictator, cruelly treating his people who reacted against it, not out of any jihadist wish, but that was taken advantage of. Libya, another vacuum post-Gaddafi, and Yemen, really dysfunctional from the start. So, the bigger challenge, I guess, of contributing to overall global stability is a very important part of. This is an aspect of a bigger challenge of the goal of seeking global stability. But just bringing it back to our region, it's believed there's quite a lot of Indonesian, a significant number of Indonesians have gone to the Middle East and been part of these operations and will come back. But they don't have to go there, of course, because they see it on the television every night, and if you're that way inclined, you don't have to travel across the world to get into this contest of the believers against the unbelievers. And you mentioned Jemaat Islamiyah remained in Indonesia, southern Malaysia, southern Philippines, throughout, and they now seem to be more often associating themselves with the Islamic State. Or it's sort of become a brand that they can grab hold of and say, we're all in this together. Have you got any thoughts as to the spread into Southeast Asia and whether there's something we should be doing we're not doing?
Let me just make a couple of comments. First of all, back up in time, immediately after 9/11, desperate effort made to we had no idea of how many more 9/11s were in the pipeline. And so there was a desperate effort made to disrupt what might have been on the way. And in that regard, we received here in this country, a tremendous amount of cooperation from our traditional allies in this, in terms of sharing of intelligence, sharing of resources to deal with this. There were a number of other countries that, in my view, would have preferred to, in a sense, remain neutral in what they saw as a contest between Al-Qaeda and the West. But Al-Qaeda itself, through its alumni that had graduated from its training camps in Afghanistan, carried on a global campaign. And so we immediately saw terrorist campaigns in Indonesia, Tunisia, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Morocco, and those countries, faced with an immediate challenge to their own governments, also then became part of this network, even though that in many cases was uncomfortable for them politically, but it did produce what was ultimately unprecedented cooperation, international cooperation among intelligence services and law enforcement organizations. As 9/11, simply the scale of that event, as it has become a more a distant shadow, some of that cooperation has, I don't want to say it's fallen apart, but it's not at the level of intensity it was in, let's say, the period of 2001 to 2006 or 7 or something like that. So that's one dimension. The second thing is that unquestionably, the creation of the Islamic State, the declaration of the caliphate, even though this is an assertion, in a sense, did energize this extremist community, and it caused great excitement. And there were people telling us, this is several years ago now, two years ago, that almost 2 years ago, this has created great excitement in Indonesia. I mean, the Indonesians thought, in a sense, they were through this, and suddenly there is this ferment of the Islamic State was galvanizing people. That coincides with a third development, particularly in Indonesia, and that is some of these people who were apprehended and arrested in this earlier campaign, 2002, 2003, 2004 period, they now are coming out of prison. Now, during that time of prison, I mean, that hasn't dented their determination one bit. If anything, it has contributed to their dedication to this. As they come back onto the streets, in effect, and now galvanized by this new vision, and at the same time, as I said, we have, not that we have allowed, it's difficult to sustain the intensity of cooperation over a long period of time. Long wars are very hard. But that has allowed now the possibility of a real resurgence in this kind of activity in places like Indonesia, like the southern Philippines, potentially in Malaysia, but in areas where we thought we had, in a sense, when I say we, that's a collective we, had pounded it down once, and they're back.